The midday sun shone brightly over San Diego, making the city's busy streets glow with golden light. People walked quickly on the sidewalks, the sound of their shoes clicking, cars hummed in the distance, and laughter came from outdoor cafes. But even with all this noise, Clara felt quiet inside. Her small hands touched the rough edge of a trash can. It was cold and hard. She felt the soft vibrations in her feet from a nearby bus stopping, reminding her of the world she couldn't fully hear. Clara was 10 years old and deaf. She had learned to understand life in ways other than sound. She squinted up at the bright sunlight, looking at people's faces for kindness. Most people didn't notice her. Some frowned and spoke words she couldn't hear, but could feel were unkind. Her stomach growled, and she pressed her hand on it, trying to stop the hunger. Reaching into the trash, she found a crumpled sandwich wrapper. It was empty. She sighed and walked slowly, her old sneakers scuffing the uneven sidewalk. As she moved toward a quiet corner of the street, she saw a man sitting on a bench. He was busy talking on his phone. Across the road, a group of teenagers laughed loudly, carefree and happy. Clara paused, watching them, hoping to grab an empty soda can without them noticing. But there were too many people. She turned toward an alley instead, where the shadows felt safer. Inside a shiny black car parked nearby, a man named Elias noticed her. The noisy city seemed to fade as he focused on her. He saw her thin frame move carefully, her head turning quickly at every motion. Elias thought she looked like someone who knew how to survive. The car's engine hummed softly, but Elias wasn't checking his phone or watch. He was watching Clara. She stopped by another trash can, her small hands searching through it. A man in a blue jacket walked by, muttering something, and Clara quickly pulled her hand back. Elias opened his car door. "Wait," his driver said, surprised. "Do you need something here?" Elias didn't answer. He stepped onto the sidewalk, his polished shoes quiet against the pavement. He adjusted his neat suit and walked toward Clara. She noticed him and froze. Her eyes darted to his face, his sharp blue eyes and neat beard, then to his shiny shoes. She looked down quickly, her shoulders stiffening. Elias crouched to her level and spoke softly. "Are you hungry?" She stared at his lips, watching them move. Her hands curled into fists. Strangers who asked questions often weren't kind. She tilted her head, her face wary. Elias saw her hesitation. Slowly, he pulled a wrapped granola bar from his pocket and held it out. "For you," he said, making sure she could see his lips. Clara's eyes flickered between him and the granola bar. Her stomach growled again. Carefully, she reached out and took it. The crinkling wrapper made her pause. Could she trust him? "Eat," Elias said gently. "It's safe." Clara opened the wrapper slowly. She took a small bite. The sweet taste felt almost too much after so many days of hunger. She chewed slowly, watching Elias. He stood up slightly to give her space but didn't leave. "My name's Elias," he said, speaking slowly so she could read his lips. "You don't have to stay here. Come with me." Clara frowned. She didn't understand all his words, but his face looked kind. He said one more word, "safe," and pointed to his car. Her eyes followed his hand, then returned to his face. She took another bite of the granola bar, still unsure, but something in his eyes made her feel like maybe she could trust him. Slowly, she nodded. Elias held out his hand. Clara hesitated, then placed her small hand in his. Together, they walked toward his car. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt a tiny flicker of something new, safety. Clara's feet sank into the soft carpet as she stepped into Elias's big house. She stopped in the doorway, staring at the shiny marble floor stretching out in front of her. Everything looked so fancy and clean, so different from the streets. The air smelled nice, like flowers, but it made her feel nervous. Her fingers brushed the smooth wall as she steadied herself. She glanced down at the floor, noticing how different it felt from the rough pavement she was used to. A soft vibration from a big clock somewhere in the house hummed through her feet. It was steady and calming, though she wasn't used to it. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, making the room shine with patterns of light and shadow. Elias stood a few steps ahead, watching her. Even though his tie was gone and his suit looked less perfect after the day, he still looked calm. He pointed toward a room. "Go ahead," he said slowly. "This is your home now." Clara blinked and looked at his lips to understand. She stepped carefully into the room, her hand brushing a leather chair. She quickly pulled her hand back, afraid she might ruin something so clean. Everything here looked too perfect to touch. "You can sit," Elias said, smiling. He pointed to the chair. "It's okay." Clara hesitated, then sat on the very edge of the chair. Her small body barely made a dent in the cushion. She fidgeted with her hands and glanced at Elias, worried she might have done something wrong. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Clara jumped, her eyes wide. A woman walked in. Her heels clicked loudly on the floor. She wore a fancy dress, her hair neatly styled. The woman barely looked at Clara before turning to Elias. "What's this?" she asked sharply. Clara shrank back, curling her hands into fists. She didn't need to hear the words to know the woman wasn't happy. Elias stepped closer to Clara, standing slightly in front of her. "This is Clara," he said calmly. "She'll be staying with us." The woman, whose name was Margaret, raised an eyebrow. "Staying with us?" she repeated. Her voice was cold and surprised. Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue loudly. Instead, she gave Clara a look that wasn't warm or kind. Clara hunched her shoulders, feeling small under Margaret's gaze. "She's staying," Elias said firmly. Then he turned back to Clara, his expression softening. "Come on," he said gently, pointing toward the stairs. "I'll show you your room." Clara stood slowly and followed Elias. She moved carefully, trying not to make any noise. As they climbed the big staircase, she glanced back. Margaret was still standing there, watching them with cold eyes. Clara's fingers brushed the smooth railing, feeling like everything around her was too clean and fancy. Elias stopped at a door and opened it. Inside was a small, clean room. The bed had soft, white blankets, and a rug covered the floor. Clara stepped inside cautiously, her feet sinking into the fluffy carpet. It felt strange, too soft, too different from what she knew. "Everything here is yours," Elias said. He leaned down so she could see his face. "Take your time. You get used to it." Clara nodded, but she still felt unsure. Her hands tightened into small fists as she stood in the middle of the room. Even though Elias had said she was safe, Clara didn't know if she believed it yet. The sunlight in Clara's new room felt softer today. She wasn't sure if it was the light or if she was starting to notice quiet moments she hadn't before. She sat on the bed, cross-legged, holding a small leather notebook Elias had given her that morning. It had a pen tucked inside. Elias had handed it to her at breakfast, sliding it across the table. "For drawing or writing," he said slowly, letting her see each word. "Whatever you want." Clara hadn't drawn or written anything since her mom passed away. It felt strange and private. But Elias's face looked calm, not expecting anything, so she took the notebook and nodded. Now, in her room, she held the pen over the first page. Slowly, she began to draw simple shapes and patterns. Circles and swirls filled the paper without much thought. "Everything okay?" Elias's voice surprised her. She looked up, watching his lips form the words. He stood in the doorway, his sleeves rolled up. He pointed to the notebook. "Do you like it?" Clara nodded a little, holding the notebook tightly. Elias came closer and sat on the edge of the bed, leaving space between them. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It had drawings of hand signs on it. "I thought this might help," he said, handing it to her. Clara hesitated, then took it and looked at the paper. It showed simple signs like "thank you" and "sorry," drawn clearly. She looked up at him, confused. "We'll practice together," he said. He raised his hand and showed her the sign for hello. Clara's fingers twitched, trying to copy him. Slowly, her hand made the same motion. It felt stiff and clumsy, but Elias smiled like she'd done something amazing. "Good," he said. "That's good." Downstairs, Margaret paced the dining room, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. She was frustrated. Days had passed since Elias brought Clara home, and Margaret was running out of patience. At lunch, her irritation showed clearly as Clara picked carefully at her food. Margaret set her glass of water on the table harder than she needed to. "This arrangement isn't working," she said, glancing at Elias. "It's not sustainable." Elias looked up from his meal, his face calm but serious. "What do you mean, Margaret?" Margaret sighed and leaned forward, her voice low but sharp. It's about the child, Elias. And not just any child, she's difficult. Do you think you can handle this all by yourself? Clara paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. She froze, her body stiffening as she watched Margaret. Clara couldn't hear every word, but she could tell by the tone that it wasn't kind. She's not a burden, Elias said, his voice calm but firm. There was a warning in his tone. I didn't say she was, Margaret replied, crossing her arms. But let's be honest, Elias. This is your project. You decided this without asking anyone. Now we all have to pretend this is normal. Clara's fingers gripped her fork tightly, her knuckles turning white. She kept her head down, staring at the small bites left on her plate. The dining room felt bigger, and the silence between the words felt heavier. Elias sighed deeply and set his napkin on the table. If you're trying to make her feel like she doesn't belong, Margaret, you're doing a great job. I'm just being realistic, Margaret said, her voice softening just a little. You can't fix everything just by meaning well. Clara pushed her plate away, her chest feeling tight. She quietly slipped out of her chair and left the room. She didn't need to hear the rest to know she was the one being talked about. Later that evening, Clara sat on her bed, curled up in the corner with her notebook. She looked at the drawings she'd made earlier, but now they seemed blurry under the dim light. She flipped to a blank page and wrote in uneven but careful letters. I'm not a burden. She stared at the words for a moment, her throat tightening. Then she turned the page and began to draw again. She made swirls and shapes with her pen, each line helping her feel stronger in her own quiet way. Outside her room, Elias paused in the hallway. He could hear the faint scratching of her pen on the paper. He didn't knock, knowing she needed some space. But as he walked away, his jaw tightened. He wanted to help her, but he wasn't sure how. The next morning, Elias stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter. The early sunlight peeked through the blinds, making thin stripes on the wall. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden floor, but Elias's mind was racing. Clara had been so silent lately, not just in words, but in the way she acted. She hardly made a sound or took up space, like she thought being invisible might make her easier to accept. Elias thought about how her hands had trembled when Margaret spoke at lunch the day before. He thought about how she'd slipped upstairs so quietly, as if she didn't want to be noticed. That afternoon, Elias made a decision. He drove to a small clinic downtown. The lady behind the counter raised an eyebrow when she saw him in his fancy suit, but her expression softened when he explained why he was there. For your daughter? She asked kindly. Elias hesitated for a moment. Then he said yes. Clara was sitting on her bed later that day, her notebook on her lap, when Elias appeared at the door. He held a small box in his hands. Walking slowly into the room, he set the box down on the bed and crouched to meet her eyes. I have something for you, he said, speaking carefully. Clara tilted her head, her eyes flicking between the box and Elias's face. Elias opened the lid, showing her a small, shiny hearing aid inside. This will help you hear, he said softly, pointing to his ear, then hers. Clara hesitated, her fingers reaching out to touch the device. Elias stayed patient, showing her how to wear it. She placed it over her ear with his help. At first it felt strange, a soft buzzing sound. Clara instinctively reached up, touching it as if to steady herself. Then Elias adjusted a small button, and suddenly, Clara could hear everything. The faint ticking of the grandfather clock, the soft rustling of Elias's clothes, and even the quiet hum of the house. Clara, Elias said, his voice clear. For the first time, the sound matched the way his lips moved. Her eyes widened, and she blinked. Elias smiled. You're safe now, he said gently. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she nodded. Her hands brushed against the hearing aid as she whispered, Thank you. Later, in the dining room, Margaret stood watching Elias adjust the hearing aid for Clara again. This is too much, she said sharply. Elias didn't look up. What's too much about helping her? She doesn't need all this, Margaret argued. She's just herself. You can't change that. Elias stood up and faced her, his eyes cold. She's not a problem to solve. She's a child who's been through more than we can imagine. Clara glanced between them, her body shrinking as she felt the tension in the room. Margaret scoffed. "You're not her father, Elias." Elias straightened. "No," he said quietly, "but I'm the only one trying to be there for her." Margaret turned and left, her footsteps loud. Clara sat frozen, her hands in her lap. He pointed to the sofa. "Sit." Clara sat carefully, feeling the rough fabric of the couch. The air smelled a little damp, like old clothes left in the rain. Zachary walked away, leaving her alone. Clara held her notebook close to her chest. It made her feel safe in this strange place. Time seemed to move very slowly. After what felt like forever, a big man walked into the room. His heavy footsteps made the floor shake a little. He stopped in front of her, looking at her from head to toe. "So," he said in a deep, rough voice, "this is Eva's kid." Clara didn't need anyone to tell her who he was. She knew from her mom's late-night whispers. This was Victor. Her mom used to sound worried when she talked about him. Clara's fingers squeezed her notebook tightly. Victor didn't sit. He stood tall and scary. "Your mom owed me a lot," he said, "and now she's not here to pay." Clara wanted to say something, but her voice was stuck. She just stared at him, her chest feeling tight with fear. Victor crouched down, bringing his face closer to hers. "You understand, right? Debts don't go away. Someone has to pay." Clara nodded quickly, her throat hurting from holding back tears. "Good," Victor said, standing up. "Then you'll work. Do what I say, when I say it. Maybe then we'll call it even." Days turned into weeks, but Clara couldn't remember how many. The mansion was huge, but felt like a prison. She had to scrub floors, clean furniture, and tidy rooms no one even used. Her small hands hurt from scrubbing so much. The house was always cold, no matter how many clothes she wore. Unlike Elias's home, where quietness felt peaceful, this house's silence was scary. Every creak of the floor, every muffled sound behind closed doors, felt like a warning. Zachary was always watching her, his sharp eyes following her every move. He didn't talk much, but his sneers and gestures made it clear she wasn't wanted there, only useful. Clara didn't cry, even when her arms hurt, when her stomach growled because she missed meals, or when she felt like she couldn't breathe from how heavy everything felt. Instead, she found small ways to stay strong. She hid her notebook under the thin mattress where she slept. Late at night, when the house was finally quiet, she would take it out and draw by the dim light of a single bulb. Her drawings were often dark, full of scary shadows and sharp lines. But sometimes, she drew a ray of sunlight, reminding herself of Elias's kind words. "You're safe now." One evening, while scrubbing the base of a grand staircase, Zachary stopped in front of her. "You think this is bad?" he said. "You should be grateful Victor's letting you work off your mom's debt. Most people don't get that chance." Clara didn't look up. She kept scrubbing, even though her hands shook. "You'll break," Zachary said, leaning down so their faces were close. "Kids like you always do." Clara looked at him, her eyes strong and determined. She didn't say anything, but her gaze told him she wouldn't give up. Zachary sneered and stood up. "We'll see." That night, Clara sat on her small bed, her notebook open on her lap. She drew a little house with big windows and warm light shining through them. It was a memory of Elias's home. Her chest tightened as she missed it so much. For now, she was stuck in Victor's world. But deep down, she held on to hope. She had escaped once before, and she believed she could do it again. Meanwhile, Elias searched the streets of San Diego. Weeks had passed since Clara went missing, and every day without her felt like a heavy weight on his heart. He looked everywhere, shelters, shops, even places he didn't like to go. Every lead led to nothing. It was like Clara had vanished. One night, Elias leaned against his car, staring at the empty street. The cold air bit at his skin, but he didn't care. He called another number from his list of possible leads. "Still no sign of her," he said, his voice tired. "Let me know if you hear anything." When the call ended, he stayed there, staring into the distance. Margaret, his wife, suggested they visit her brother Victor. Elias didn't like the idea. Victor wasn't a good man, but Margaret's suggestion made some sense. Maybe it would give him a fresh perspective. The next day, Elias and Margaret drove to Victor's mansion. The house was huge and cold, with tall gates and sharp lines. It didn't feel welcoming at all. A butler led them into a sitting room and said, Victor will be with you shortly." While waiting, Elias heard a faint swishing sound. It was the sound of a mop. He followed the noise down a hallway, leaving Margaret behind. When he turned a corner, he froze. At the end of the hall was Clara. She looked tired, her eyes dull, and her movements slow. She was mopping the floor, a bucket at her feet. "Clara," Elias called, his voice breaking. She stopped, her hands gripping the mop tightly. When she looked at him, her eyes filled with disbelief. "Elias," she whispered, her voice shaking. He ran to her, kneeling down to look at her face. "What are you doing here?" he asked. But before she could answer, heavy footsteps echoed behind them. Elias turned to see Victor. "So," Victor said, smirking, "you found her." Elias stood up, placing himself in front of Clara. "She's coming with me," he said firmly. Victor laughed. "Not so fast. She's paying off her mom's debt. You wouldn't want to interfere, would you?" "Name your price," Elias said, his voice steady. Victor's smirk faded. "You think you can just buy her freedom?" "I'll pay whatever it takes," Elias said. "But she's leaving with me." Clara clung to Elias's arm, her fingers trembling. For the first time in weeks, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Later, in Victor's study, Elias and Victor argued over the cost. Clara sat quietly in the corner, clutching her notebook. She couldn't believe Elias had come for her. Finally, Elias knelt in front of her. "We're leaving," he said gently. She stared at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You're taking me?" "Of course," Elias said, his voice kind. "You're coming home?" The drive back to Elias's house was quiet. Clara sat in the back seat, holding her notebook tightly. When they arrived, Elias opened her door and helped her out. "You're safe now," he said, his voice full of warmth. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, feeling sad. Her thoughts felt heavy, like a big weight on her chest. She felt like she didn't belong in her own home anymore. She watched her husband, Elias, spend more time with Clara, a girl Margaret didn't know how to accept. It made her heart ache. In the weeks that followed, Clara worked hard to learn. Elias wrote down simple words and signs to teach her. They sat together at the dining table, practicing. Clara watched Elias's hands and copied his movements. One day, when Clara managed to sign her name, Elias smiled and said, "You're doing great." Clara's smile was small, but happy. She signed, hard. Her movements were slow, but she was trying. Elias nodded. "It's hard now, but you're getting better. Don't give up." Clara looked at him with soft eyes. In that moment, she realized he wasn't just teaching her signs. He was helping her believe in herself again. Margaret felt left out. She avoided the dining room during their lessons. Sometimes she stayed upstairs. Other times, she left the house entirely. One evening, she stood in the doorway and saw Elias and Clara laughing together over a mistake. Something inside her felt like it broke. She quickly walked away, her footsteps loud in the quiet house. Later, in her room, Margaret sat by the window, staring at the night sky. She wondered for the first time if she was angry at Clara for the wrong reasons. Could she be jealous of a child? But even thinking that felt too hard to admit. In Clara's room, late at night, she sat with her notebook. She wrote down the words she had learned that day in neat rows. At the bottom of the page, she drew a little house with glowing windows. She touched the drawing gently, feeling a tightness in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt something other than fear or sadness. Down the hall, Elias stood leaning against the wall. He saw the light under Clara's door. He was tired, but he felt proud. Clara was back, and she was starting to feel at home again. Margaret's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "You're choosing her over everything." He shook his head. This wasn't a choice. It was a promise he had made to himself when he brought Clara into their home. He had to keep it no matter what. The house felt quieter these days. Time had changed it into a sadder, lonelier place. Even the smell of lavender, once comforting, didn't feel the same anymore. Years later, Clara was now a grown woman, 30 years old. She stood in the study, which was now hers, running her fingers over Elias's old desk. She remembered how he used to write her lessons there. Now, the desk was covered in her own papers, bills, documents, and plans. She had become responsible for everything Elias had left behind. Elias had passed away suddenly. One morning, he had a heart attack while making his coffee. Clara found him in the kitchen, his coffee cup still warm. Her world froze in that moment. She remembered the sharp ticking of the clock, the sound of her shaky breaths, and the creak of the floor as she knelt beside him. The days that followed were a blur. Strangers came to say nice things, but their words felt empty. Margaret sat stiffly during the funeral, looking pale but calm. Clara didn't have time to cry. There was too much to do. Months passed, and Clara threw herself into taking care of the house. It no longer felt like a safe place. It felt like a memory of the man who had saved her. Every day, she walked through the halls, making sure everything was in order, just like Elias had taught her. Margaret, now in her 60s, was weaker and quieter. Her sharp words were still there, but she needed Clara's help for everything. One afternoon, Clara brought her tea. "I don't need your pity," Margaret snapped. Clara placed the tea gently on the table. "It's not pity, Margaret. It's tea." Margaret's hand shook as she picked up the cup. She muttered, "Thank you," but didn't look at Clara. Their relationship was still hard, but it was changing. Margaret, once strong and demanding, now depended on Clara. And Clara, despite all the bitterness she had faced, cared for Margaret with kindness. One evening, Clara sat by the fireplace, looking at old photographs. She picked up one of Elias, where he was holding her notebook and pointing at a word she had written. She smiled, remembering how proud he was the day she signed her first full sentence. A sound made Clara look up. Margaret stood in the doorway. "You miss him," Margaret said quietly. Clara nodded. "Every day." Margaret hesitated before walking into the room. She sat in the chair across from Clara, moving slowly. "I didn't understand," Margaret admitted, staring at the fire. "I didn't understand why he cared so much, why he chose you." Clara stayed quiet, her heart heavy. "But now," Margaret's voice trembled, "I see it. You gave him purpose." Clara's eyes softened. "He gave me everything," she said. For a long time, they sat in silence, the fire warming the room. The house felt less lonely. Clara cared for the garden, remembering how much Elias loved it. It helped her feel close to him. One rainy afternoon, Clara was writing a letter when Margaret walked in, holding old documents. "I thought I could help," Margaret said. Clara smiled and invited her to sit. Together, they sorted through the papers. For the first time, it felt like they were working together. The house felt lighter, filled with memories of Elias's love and lessons. Later, Clara visited Elias's grave. It was a peaceful spot by the ocean, with an oak tree nearby. She carried a bouquet of lilies, his favorite flowers, and placed them gently by the gravestone. "Hi, Elias," she said softly. "I hope I'm making you proud. You saved me, and I'll never stop trying to live the way you taught me." Behind her, Margaret appeared, her cane tapping on the cobblestones. Clara turned and smiled. "You always bring lilies," Margaret said. "They were his favorite," Clara replied. Margaret looked at the grave. "He was a decent man," she said quietly. "He was," Clara agreed. Margaret's voice softened. "I used to think you didn't belong, but I was wrong. You gave him purpose, and you've done more for this family than I ever thought possible." Clara's eyes filled with emotion. "He believed in both of us, Margaret," she said. "He never stopped." Margaret rested her hand lightly on Clara's arm. "Thank you," she said. Together, they stood by Elias's grave, their shadows blending as one. They carried his memory forward, honoring the love and kindness he had shared with them both. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more content like it, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest, inspiring and heartwarming stories and have the opportunity to engage with our growing community. Additionally, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback in the comment section below. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to sharing more captivating narratives with you.